Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm blessed to have this opportunity to speak to you all. So the name of this speech is Young Men in the Church. And as a young man, I've realized that my generation is facing a significant mental health crisis that's affecting the lives of many men like me. According to the Washington Post, suicides rose 8% among males ages 15 to 24, which was the largest increase of any group in 2021. Now, through this talk, there will be a lot of generalizations of young men, so this may not fit, and I would doubt that it fits the bill of all young men out there, but I derived this from the experiences that I've shared with classmates, students, and friends in my life. But I believe that this crisis is due largely to how young men have conceptualized their masculinity and what it means to be a man today. The term of masculinity has been deeply disrupted, and in turn it has caused many to have a fractured sense of identity and belonging. Today I want to talk to you about how this crisis and the church, specifically men in the church, can help. I believe the church can play a significant role in helping these young men find their place in a society by providing them with positive male role models and a sense of community. So let's explore this crisis together and see how we can positively impact the lives of these young men. I'll begin with a brief anecdote. During my senior year of high school, I had the opportunity of taking an internship class, the goal of which was to explore potential career opportunities, and so I decided to intern with my pastor and to explore the ins and outs of living and working in parish ministry. Our first initial meeting of the internship was centered around questions that I had about the internship, general questions about expectations, roles, meeting times, etc. But then, as pastors often do, the conversation changed to questions about my life, questions about my plans post-high school, and then the questions I had about faith in God. And during our conversation, I got what may be perhaps the most enlightening piece of information from my pastor, and it was this, that not all questions have answers. Having that come from someone who I looked up to as a role model and a pastor to tell me that not all questions have answers caused me to let out an almost audible sigh of relief at the realization of that truth, that I don't have to have it all figured out, nor am I going to. And that one piece of information from that interaction, I think, encapsulates the role of what male mentorship has had in my life. At that moment, I knew that men, and men of faith especially, don't have to have it all figured out. We can't know it all. We can't always anticipate what's next, and we must surrender ourselves to this fact that some things will be unknowable and unanswerable. But what about the questions that do have answers? I'll spend the next 10 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, trying to explore and provide an explanation as to why young men are struggling and how I believe the church can help. A lot of young men are struggling to find where they belong and fit inside the larger scope of society. As a result, this has caused a collective identity crisis. And I believe a large part of this situation revolves around how we conceptualize masculinity. The questions of, what does being a man mean? And how does one effectively live that identity out harmoniously with others? If you dive into any of the literature surrounding masculinity, you very quickly encounter the term toxic masculinity. And I want to make it apparent that I don't wish to explore the topic of toxic masculinity itself. I just want to acknowledge one distinct aspect of how its implications in the lives of young men. I think it's relatively uncontroversial to state that the term toxic masculinity and the concepts surrounding it have deeply shaped and reconstructed society's notions of what it means to be a man. Its attempt to identify the negative and harmful attributes of masculinity, and while these criticisms of masculinity were aptly needed to address some of the real societal problems at hand, it's left the conception of masculinity to be defined by its deficits and not its contributions. Personally, I grew up largely learning from the media and society at large what I should not be as a man. I learned things like not to be violent and aggressive. I learned the problems with being stoic or unemotional. I learned all these things, what not to aim toward, but I never learned what to aim at. I'll switch. In the winters, I work as a downhill ski instructor. And when I teach the more advanced lessons and we get into the more challenging terrain, I tell my students not to aim at the trees, but instead to look at the spaces between them to find the best path forward. This is because I have learned from years of painstaking experience and one broken back that if you look at the tree, the very thing that you want to avoid, it's the one thing you'll hit and inevitably run into. And I think this same concept can be translated to masculinity. If these young men are trying to grasp at the concept of masculinity and are focusing only on its problems and its harmfulness and its deficits, and we only teach the things that we should not be aiming at, then we will inevitably hit those things. I think this is what's caused this recent resurgence in the following of these pseudo-masculine social media influencers who urge men to be aggressive and dominating. When young men try to embrace their masculinity, they're finding only these notions of what masculinity's deficits are and not its assets. Just the other week, I had the opportunity to sit down with a group of my peers and try to define masculinity and what it meant to us. And it became very apparent that it's nearly impossible to find a concrete or all-encompassing definition of masculinity. I think that's one of its most beautiful attributes. It occurred to me that masculinity can't be defined in isolation or on its own. Instead, it can only be defined with our relationships with others. Masculinity is not a set of attributes associated with men, it's how you interact with others as a man. And in order to learn what masculinity is, we have to have some sort of template or blueprint, and more specifically, a role model. Be it our dads, pastors, brothers, friends, or coaches, we need male mentorship in order to understand what masculinity means and what it should look like. I think back to one of the most challenging moments in my life. Before coming to PLU, I was a student at the University of Wisconsin, go Badgers. And very early on in my time there, I realized it was not a good fit for me. I had to make the decision to drop out and move back halfway across the country. I had to turn down opportunities that I had worked extremely hard to get. I had to re-examine my core values and what I wanted in life, and I had to completely restructure my sense of vocation. Not an easy thing to do at 18. And one of the first persons I called during this process to understand exactly what I was going through was my pastor. And it was because of this critical relationship that I had with the male role model that enabled me to process and understand what I was going through and successfully work through it. As we face these life-altering challenges that inevitably come with adulthood, we need these mentors to guide us and show us and how to live out our identities of being men. My notions of leadership, service, and gratitude, some of the deepest attributes that I hold most dear to myself, came from my cross-country coach in high school. He taught me not only the ins and outs of running, but the ins and outs of character. He was a man who truly led by example and has kept me accountable to this day. My insatiable love for knowledge, my boundless curiosity for life, and my inability to never stop asking questions is inextricably linked to the role of male mentorship that my dad had in my life. A scientist by training and an artist at heart, he pushes me to always indulge in new areas of study and has always supported me in all my endeavors of exploring life in new places. My male role models have clearly and carefully shaped my notions of masculinity and have made me the man I am today. And I'm extremely blessed to have had these individuals in my life. But as a lot of young men who have become increasingly isolated from positive, tangible, interpersonal relationships, we've begun to see a lack of personal face-to-face interaction with male role models, and it's caused a lot of people to find sources online to fill that need. And it's not that there aren't good examples of positive masculinity online. There are a lot. But unfortunately, the algorithms of recommendation are not centered around positivity. They're centered around the loudest pieces of information, the ones with the most controversy, and the ones with the most clicks. I look out into this crowd, and I see a room full of male mentors, deeply rooted in their faith. Good men, men of God, and you all can be mentors to these young men. These young men need you, and they need a relationship with you, and they need to understand what it looks like to have positive males like you in their lives. There are a plethora of things that young men are lacking in lives. They feel like they don't belong in society. They don't feel a need to be accountable for their actions because they think they can no longer add anything of value. A lot of men are lacking a sense of love and being loved by someone. The church and its members are in a unique position. We can offer a place where young men can build a sense of community, take on a feeling of accountability and responsibility, and form a relationship with a God who knows and loves them. An overwhelming majority of the men I've encountered in the Lutheran Church and the church at large, through their faith and their masculinity, have exhibited a commitment to the things that the church holds most dear: unconditional love, acceptance, recognizing our faults and our sins, understanding that we are forgiven, and moving forward with the mission of Christ. Many of the young men that I've encountered who feel lonely and isolated are itching to be a part of a community. These young men want to feel as if they're adding value to the lives of others, and most of all, they want to feel as if they belong. Congregations, these communities of Christ, have the foundations already in place to be a basis of support for young men. Churches foster a sense of belonging, and they can now provide opportunities for young men to serve and can prepare a place where they can feel a sense of accountability and acceptance. You don't necessarily have to focus on convincing all of them to become Christians, but you can still offer them opportunities to live out the gospel. Young men need the church, and the church needs young men. Now, I'll be honest, I don't have an exact answer on how we can get young men re-engaged. Many pastors and congregational leaders have spent far more time than I have trying to uncover the secret to getting young men back into the church. Mostly, I just want to bring this to everyone's attention that there are dire needs for both groups to re-engage with one another. I do, however, have 3 brief recommendations that I'd like to share and that I think could help. The first is don't compete with the desire for fun. Young men have plenty of opportunities to grab dinner with friends, play a sport of their choice, beat the next level of a video game, or go to a party. The church has far more value and meaning to offer than just a place to have fun. This isn't to say that church can't be fun. I have a blast here, personally, or it shouldn't have opportunities for fun, because it does and it should, but marketing as your hook, it's not going to be a sustainable way to attract young men. Secondly, lowering the barrier for non-Christian affiliated men. An increasing number of individuals either have experience in some additional faith background or are not used to or interested in Christianity. Lowering the barrier of entry so that all young men, no matter where they are in their journey of faith, can approach. Allowing those willing to lend a hand to be involved in a community centered around love, grace, and service. And these paths of service don't have to be centered on God to still be doing God's work. The third is personal invitations, and this is where you all come in. Nothing feels better than knowing that someone is thinking of you and cares enough to call and invite you to something. Young men are used to receiving texts and emails inviting them to join some organization or engage in some sort of activity, but a phone call is far more personable and a meaningful way to reach out. So here's my call to action. I urge each and every one of you to reach out to a young man in your life, to provide them with opportunities where they can center themselves around acts of service, leadership, and grace. And I mean, pick up your phone, call them, let them know that you're here, that you want to grab lunch or get a cup of coffee, or that you want to invite them to a service project, help out with a community dinner, or maybe just volunteer in decorating the church for Christmas. Not all of them are going to say yes, and in fact, some of them won't return your call, but some will. And if some get engaged and see the value in community and the mentorship that the church has to offer, others will follow. So to recap, because of the necessary criticisms that masculinity has undergone, we have been left to define masculinity by its deficits and not its assets. And in fact, I would argue that masculinity cannot be defined in isolation. It is a relationship between a man and the world that surrounds him, his community. And because we have been faced with this definition of deficits, we have begun to run into the problems we have been trying to avoid. And in order to ensure that young men of today exhibit the characteristics of positive masculinity, we need mentors. Men to show other men what it means to be a positive man in society. And what better role models than men of the church, men of faith. You, men of unconditional love and grace, men of acceptance and humility, and ones willing to admit that not all questions have answers. Thank you.